He was just the cook to everyone else, a ghost in a starched white apron, his face softened by the steam that rose from his stopboats. His name was Arthur, a simple name for a simple man who moved with the quiet, shuffling grace of his 78 years. To the residents of the Maple Creek Senior Living Community, he was a fixture, as much a part of the building as the faint scent of lavender polish in the hallways and the grandfather clock that chimed faithfully in the lobby. He served them their meals 3 times a day, a predictable rhythm of roast chicken, meatloaf, and fish on Fridays. The food was good, comforting, but no one ever thought to ask what made it so. They never noticed the way he would close his eyes when he tasted a sauce, as if listening for a distant melody, or the way his gnarled, arthritic fingers could chop a carrot with a precision that defied his age. To them, he was just Arthur, but to the ingredients on his weathered butcher block, to the copper pans that gleamed with a lifetime of care, he was a keeper of secrets, a man who had once been someone else entirely. Every morning, long before the sun had a chance to warm the dew on the manicured lawns of Maple Creek, Arthur would be in his kitchen. It was a modest place, all stainless steel and practical linoleum, but he treated it like a cathedral. He didn't cook with recipes from the corporate issued binder, he cooked from memory, from a library of flavors stored deep within him. He would prepare the oatmeal not with water, but with milk infused overnight with a cinnamon stick and a strip of orange zest, a small, unseen act of rebellion that made the morning gruel taste of warmth and sunshine. His soups were never from a can. They started with roasted bones and vegetables, simmered for hours until the broth was liquid gold, rich with a depth that could only be coaxed by time and patience. He was an artist painting in a world that had gone colorblind, and no one seemed to notice the masterpieces he placed before them day after day. There was one, however, who did. Her name was Eleanor Vance, a retired professor of literature. Eleanor still possessed a mind as sharp as a shard of glass, and a palate that had not been dulled by age. She had lived a life of noticing, of seeing the hidden metaphor in a poem, the subtle foreshadowing in a novel, and she noticed Arthur. She noticed that the gravy on the meatloaf had the unmistakable, nutty aroma of a proper roux, not the pasty taste of cornstarch. She noticed the delicate hint of tarragon in the chicken salad, a sophisticated touch that had no business being in a place like this. She would often linger after meals, her walker parked beside her usual table, and watch him as he cleaned his station, his movements economical and profound. She saw not a cook, but a craftsman, but she never said a word, sensing that his anonymity was a cloak he wore for a reason, a quiet peace he had earned. She simply savored each bite, grateful for the unspoken stories he told on his plates. The days at Maple Creek drifted by in a gentle, predictable current. Arthur cooked, Eleanor noticed, and the rest of the world went on. Oblivious, the small community was a haven, a quiet final chapter for people who had already lived their noisy, complicated lives. They had no idea that their unassuming cook was a man who had once commanded a brigade of chefs in a kitchen that glittered under the lights of New York City. That his hands, now serving Jell-O cups, had once plated dishes for presidents and movie stars. He had buried that man, Antoine Dubois, decades ago, along with his grief and his 2 Michelin stars. He had traded the pressure of perfection for the solace of service, finding a strange, quiet redemption in nourishing those who, like him, were in the twilight of their years. He asked for nothing more. He didn't realize that the quiet rhythm of his world was about to be shattered by the arrival of someone who believed that food wasn't about memory or comfort, but about data and efficiency. A storm was coming, and it wore a sharp business suit and a smile that never quite reached its eyes. Her name was Celeste Monroe, and she walked into Maple Creek as if she were conquering a new territory. She was young, radiating a cold, polished energy that seemed to suck the warmth from the chintz-covered armchairs in the lobby. She was a culinary solutions consultant, a title that sounded both impressive and meaningless. The parent corporation, Apex Senior Solutions, had hired her to streamline their food service operations across 24 facilities. Her specialty was a brand of modern nutritional science that stripped food of all its romance, reducing it to a series of metrics: caloric intake, vitamin absorption, protein-to-carb ratios, and, most importantly, cost per unit. She carried a tablet like a weapon and spoke in a clipped, confident jargon that left the gentle, soft-spoken facility manager, Mr. Henderson, nodding in a dazed stupor. Alessa's first point of order was an inspection of the kitchen. She strode in during Arthur's lunch preparation, her heels clicking in aggressive rhythm on the linoleum floor. Arthur, who was carefully reducing a red wine and shallot sauce for the braised short ribs, a dish far too extravagant for the budget, but one he made using saved scraps and clever accounting, simply nodded a polite hello. Celeste ignored him. Her eyes scanned the kitchen not for its cleanliness or its order, but for its antiquities. She scoffed at the heavy copper pans hanging from a rack, inefficient heat distribution, and a sanitation liability, she muttered, tapping a note into her tablet. She saw his large stockpot, simmering gently on a back burner. She lifted the lid, sniffed the fragrant steam, and her lip curled in disdain. Bone broth. The labor cost on this is astronomical. sodium levels are unquantifiable. A powdered fortified supplement provides a more consistent nutritional profile. Arthur felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach, but his face remained a placid mask. He had dealt with people like her before, in a different lifetime. They were the ones who saw a beautiful, marbled cut of beef not as a promise of a delicious meal, but as a series of numbers on a spreadsheet. He continued to meticulously skim the fat from his sauce, his movements unhurried. Celeste finally turned her attention to him, her gaze sweeping over his slightly stooped frame and his worn, comfortable shoes. "You're the head cook?" she asked, the title sounding like an accusation. "I am," Arthur replied, his voice quiet but steady. "I've been looking over your recent supply orders." "Arthur," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "Fresh thyme? Bay leaves? Heavy cream? Do you have any idea what your quarterly food cost percentage is?" "It's nearly 7 points above the corporate benchmark." Before Arthur could respond, she swept her hand in a gesture that encompassed his entire domain. "This all has to change. The age of comfort food is over. It's inefficient, unhealthy, and frankly, it's infantilizing to our residents. My program, Nutrisphere, is the future. We're rolling it out starting next week." She tapped her tablet and a glossy presentation appeared. It showed trays of colorless, gelatinous cubes and pouches of grayish paste. "Vita servings," she announced proudly. "Each meal is scientifically engineered to provide the optimal balance of nutrients required for a senior's dietary needs. It eliminates waste, cuts prep time by 90%, and ensures perfect consistency. Food is fuel. It's time we started treating it that way." She looked at him, expecting perhaps awe or at least compliance. But Arthur's eyes weren't on her tablet. They were on the faces of the residents in the dining room. Visible through the service window, he saw Mrs. Gable, who could barely remember her own children's names, but whose face would light up with a small, beautiful smile every time she tasted his tomato soup. He saw Mr. Rodriguez, a gruff old man who never spoke a word to anyone, but who always cleaned his plate, a silent compliment that meant more to Arthur than any award he had ever received. And in that moment, Arthur knew he would not let this woman replace their small, daily joy with a nutrient paste. He didn't know how, but the quiet war had just been declared. The twist was not that Celeste wanted to change things, it was the chilling, absolute certainty with which she believed she was right, a certainty that could starve the soul just to feed the body. The first casualty of the Nutrisphere program was breakfast. For as long as anyone could remember, mornings at Maple Creek had smelled of brewing coffee, toasted bread, and Arthur's slow-cooked oatmeal. It was a gentle awakening, a comforting ritual that eased the residents into their day. Arthur's oatmeal was legendary. He used steel-cut oats, soaked overnight, and in the morning, he would stir in chopped apples, a dusting of cinnamon, and a small pat of butter, transforming a humble grain into something creamy, fragrant, and deeply satisfying. It was more than food, it was a kindness, a warm hug in a bowl on a chilling morning. But on Monday, the residents were greeted by a different scent. Nothing. The dining room was sterile, devoid of any aroma. In place of the familiar oatmeal warmer stood a sleek, silver machine. Next to it was a stack of paper cups. Celeste stood by the machine, a bright, artificial smile plastered on her face, explaining the new process to the confused residents. "Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the new and improved breakfast service. Simply place a cup under the dispenser and press the green button for your morning Vita serving. Today's flavor is original grain fortified with a complete profile of vitamins A through K." A few brave residents followed her instructions. A thick, beige, sludgy substance oozed into their cups. They stared at it, then at each other. Mr. Henderson, the manager, stood awkwardly in the corner, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Arthur was confined to the kitchen, instructed only to oversee the machine's operation. He felt like a prison guard doling out rations. Eleanor Vance was one of the last to arrive. She saw the machine, saw the grim faces of her friends sipping the beige sludge, and her back straightened. She walked directly to Celeste. "Excuse me, Miss Monroe," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I believe there has been a mistake. Where is the oatmeal?" Celeste's smile tightened. "Eleanor, isn't it? We're trying something new and much healthier. The oatmeal had far too much sugar and fat. This Vita serving has everything your body needs." Eleanor looked down at the cup in her neighbor's hand. "My body may need that," she said, her gaze lifting to meet Celeste's. "But my spirit needs the oatmeal. You are feeding our bodies, but you are starving our memories." A few other residents murmured in agreement. Celeste's patient snapped. "This is not a restaurant, Eleanor. It's a care facility. We are providing state-of-the-art nutrition based on science, not sentimental cravings. It's for your own good." She turned her back on Eleanor, dismissing her as a stubborn old woman. The atmosphere in the dining room that week was funereal. The joy had been leached out of mealtimes. The residents ate in silence, their faces grim. They were compliant, as the elderly are often forced to be, but their quiet unhappiness was a palpable force. Arthur's heart broke every time he saw another tray of untouched Vita servings come back to the kitchen. He felt powerless, a king exiled from his own kingdom. But then, On Thursday morning, a small act of rebellion took place. Arthur had come in even earlier than usual. Using a small bag of flour and a few apples he had purchased with his own money on his day off, he baked a batch of simple, rustic apple scones. He used a hidden hot plate in the back of the pantry, the delicious smell of baking cinnamon and apples carefully contained. He couldn't serve them in the dining room, but he wrapped them in napkins and, as he collected the breakfast trays, he slipped one to Eleanor, then to Mrs. Gable, then to Mr. Rodriguez. His hand would brush theirs, a warm, fragrant scone passing between them like a secret message. He said nothing, just offered a small, sad smile. The twist wasn't a grand gesture, but a tiny one. It was a whispered thank you from Mrs. Gable. A tear that welled in Eleanor's eye as she bit into the warm, buttery pastry. It was the way Mr. Rodriguez looked at him, a flicker of fierce gratitude in his old eyes, before turning to his window and eating the scone, crumb by crumb, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. This small defiance resolved nothing in the larger battle, but it forged an alliance, a secret society of souls bonded by a shared taste of kindness in a world that had suddenly turned cold and synthetic. The secret of the scones emboldened Eleanor. It was proof that the artist she had long suspected was still very much alive, even if he was working in the shadows. The taste of that simple pastry was anything but simple. It had a lightness, a perfect balance of sweet and tart, a texture that spoke of a master's touch. It was not the work of a regular institutional cook. A few days later, she waited for Arthur after the dismal lunch service, finding him in the small, sun-drenched employee patio behind the kitchen, slowly peeling an apple for his own meager lunch. She sat down opposite him, her walker resting beside the bench. For a few moments, they sat in a comfortable silence, the only sound the soft scrape of the knife against the apple's skin. "That was a dangerous thing you did, Arthur," she began, her voice gentle. "Celeste would have you fired in a heartbeat if she found out." Arthur just shrugged, not looking up from his task. "They can't live on that." "That stuff," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's not right." Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "The scone," she said, choosing her words with care. "It reminded me of a little patisserie I used to visit in Paris many years ago. It had the same integrity." She watched his hands. They stilled for just a fraction of a second, a barely perceptible pause that told her everything. She had struck a nerve. "You haven't always been a cook at places like this, have you, Arthur?" she asked softly. He set the apple and the knife down on the bench beside him, his shoulders slumping as if under a great weight. He stared at the manish-colored lawn, but his eyes were seeing something else, a different time and place. "No," he said, the word tasting of rust. "No, I haven't." And then, for the first time in over 30 years, he spoke the truth of his life to another person. The story tumbled out of him, haltingly at first, then with a quiet, cathartic flow. He told her of a young man named Antoine Dubois, a prodigy who had left his family's farm in Provence to train in the grand kitchens of Lyon and Paris. He spoke of his meteoric rise in New York, of the restaurant he and his wife, Isabelle, had poured their souls into, La Chance d'Argent, the Silver Oak. He described the thrill of earning his first, and then his second, Michelin star, the relentless pursuit of a perfection that was both a passion and a curse. His voice softened as he spoke of Isabelle, the beautiful, vibrant woman who had been the heart of his restaurant and the soul of his life. She was the one who managed the front of the house, who could charm the most difficult critic, who knew which wines would sing with his food. He described how her sudden death, a brain aneurysm that took her in an instant, had shattered his world. The color and flavor drained from his life, and from his cooking. He lost his passion, and soon after, in a devastating recession, he lost the restaurant, bankrupt and broken. Antoine Dubois disappeared. He took a bus heading west with no destination in mind and became Arthur Pinter, a man with no past. He took menial kitchen jobs, finding a strange comfort in the anonymity, in the simple, honest work of peeling potatoes and washing dishes. He was hiding not just from his creditors, but from the ghost of the man he had once been. The twist wasn't just that he was a famous chef, it was that his retreat from the world wasn't an act of failure, but an act of profound, unending grief. He wasn't hiding from shame, but from love. Listening to his story, Eleanor felt her heart ache with a deep compassion. The resolution of this quiet confession was not a plan or a promise, but a simple, profound human connection. She reached across the small table and gently placed her hand on his. "Well, Antoine," she whispered, testing the name on her tongue, "I am very pleased to finally make your acquaintance." For the first time in a long time, the ghost of Antoine Dubois felt seen. Knowing Arthur's secret changed everything for Eleanor. It was no longer just a matter of bad food. It was a matter of injustice. A genius was being forced to serve sludge by a charlatan with a tablet. Her quiet disapproval of Celeste Munro curdled into a fierce, protective anger. Celeste, meanwhile, was becoming more tyrannical, annoyed that many residents were barely touching their bed of servings. She interpreted their resistance not as a failure of her product, but as a failure of their discipline. She implemented stricter portion controls and eliminated the small comforts that remained, like the communal cookie jar and the evening hot chocolate service. Her next move was a direct assault on Arthur's last vestiges of creativity. One morning, Arthur arrived to find a new, heavy-duty padlock on the door to the walk-in pantry, where the fresh herbs, spices, and other non-essential ingredients were kept. A memo, signed by Celeste, was taped to the door. It stated that, to ensure perfect adherence to the Nutri-Sphere dietary protocols, all meal preparations would now exclusively use pre-measured, per-approved ingredient pouches. Arthur's access was restricted to the freezers full of Vita serving packs and the dispenser machine. She had effectively chained him to her system, cutting off his access to the very tools of his art. He stood before the locked door, his hand resting on the cold metal, and felt a wave of despair so profound it almost buckled his knees. She hadn't just locked a pantry, she had locked away the last remnants of Antoine Dubois. That evening, Eleanor found him sitting alone in a darkened dining room. Long after everyone else had gone to bed, he looked smaller, diminished, the light of defiance in his eyes finally extinguished. "She's won, Eleanor," he said, his voice raspy with defeat. "There's nothing left for me to do. I'm just the man who pushes the button on her machine." Eleanor sat down, her expression grim. "That's where you're wrong, Arthur. She thinks she's fighting a battle over nutrition. She has no idea she's in a war over the human soul. And in that war, a tasteless cube of gelatin is no match for a memory." She leaned in, her eyes glinting with a strategic fire that had once terrified graduate students who dared to come to her seminars unprepared. "Celeste has been bragging to Mr. Henderson," Eleanor continued, her voice a low, conspiratorial whisper. "The corporate board is coming for a site visit in 2 weeks. She's planning a big presentation to showcase the success of her program. She wants to use Maple Creek as the model for a nationwide rollout. She thinks she has it all sewn up." Arthur sighed. "So she'll show them her charts and her profit margins. They'll love it. What can we do?" This was the moment Eleanor had been waiting for. The twist was not a setback, but an opportunity in disguise. "She's building her own stage, Arthur," Eleanor said, a slow, cunning smile spreading across her face. "She's sending out the invitations and setting up the spotlight. It would be a shame to let her have the whole performance to herself. She wants to give them a taste of the future, does she? I think, with a little help, we ought to give them a taste of the past." The resolution of Arthur's despair was the spark of a new, audacious plan. He looked at Eleanor, at the fierce intelligence in her eyes, and for the first time in days, he felt a flicker of hope. The war was not over, it had just found its general. Eleanor's plan began with a single, perfectly crafted letter. Her hands, though gnarled with arthritis, could still wield a pen with an elegant, persuasive T. She wrote to a former student, a young woman named Sarah, who had become a prominent journalist for a major national newspaper. She didn't mention Vita servings or corporate efficiency. Instead, she wrote a lyrical, evocative piece about the quiet dignity of life at Maple Creek, and of a mysterious cook whose simple food seemed to hold the stories and memories of a generation. She hinted at a lost culinary artist hiding in plain sight. She ended the letter with an invitation for Sarah to attend a special presentation at the facility on the day of the board meeting. She knew Sarah's journalistic instincts would be piqued by the whiff of a human interest story. The second letter was more direct. It was addressed to Mr. Julian Croft, the notoriously discerning, old-school food critic for that same newspaper. Eleanor remembered from her research that Croft had been one of the first and most ardent champions of La Haine Starged. Decades ago, he had lamented the disappearance of Chef Antoine Dubois as one of the great tragedies of the culinary world. In her letter, she wrote only one sentence: "Sir, I believe I have found something you thought was lost forever. Maple Creek Senior Living. 2 weeks from today." She sealed both envelopes. A quiet declaration of war. While Eleanor laid the external trap, she also began to rally the internal troops. The rebellion of the scones had shown her that the residents were not a passive, defeated group. They were a community with hidden resources and a shared sense of injustice. She convened a secret meeting in the library, a small group of the most trusted and able-bodied residents. There was Mr. Rodriguez, the silent but observant former Marine Mrs. Gable, who in her moments of lucidity possessed a surprisingly sharp wit, and a handful of others who missed Arthur's cooking with a visceral ache. Eleanor laid out the situation and the audacious plan. They were going to help Arthur cook one magnificent, unforgettable meal right under Celeste's nose. The twist was the beautiful, intricate conspiracy that followed. The residents became a network of gentle spies and smugglers. The Maple Creek Community Garden, which Celeste had dismissed as a frivolous hobby, became their secret supply chain. Mrs. Gable, who spent her afternoons tending her rose bushes, began to discreetly harvest ripe, fragrant tomatoes and tuck them into her gardening basket. Mr. Rodriguez, during his morning walks, would snip sprigs of rosemary and thyme from the herb patch, hiding them in the pages of his newspaper. Others pooled their resources, using their small personal allowances to have groceries delivered by visiting family members, a bottle of good Burgundy wine, a bag of shallots, fresh mushrooms, a slab of unsalted butter. These precious, contraband ingredients were smuggled into the kitchen pantry through a loose vent in the back, a secret known only to Arthur. he found them each morning. A small, miraculous offering left by his unseen allies. The sight of this fresh produce, the smell of real herbs, was like a transfusion for his weary soul. The resolution wasn't in a single event, but in the daily acts of quiet defiance. Arthur, who had felt so utterly alone, now had an army. An army of gardeners, readers, and grandparents armed with tomatoes and thyme. He looked at the beautiful ingredients assembled before him and knew what he had to make. It would be a dish of memory, a dish of rebellion, a dish of thanks. It would be au the way Isabel had loved it. The day of the corporate presentation dawned gray and overcast, but inside the main recreational hall of Maple Creek, the atmosphere was electric with a manufactured brightness. Celeste had transformed the room. The comfortable armchairs and puzzle tables had been replaced with sterile rows of chairs facing a large projection screen. A podium stood at the front, gleaming under harsh fluorescent lights. The board members, 5 men and 2 women in severe, dark suits, sat in the front row, their faces impassive. Celeste, dressed in a sharp, white pantsuit, was in her element. She moved with a brisk, confident energy, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room as she began her presentation. She spoke of metrics, of optimization, of scalable solutions. Graphs and charts filled the screen, showing plummeting food costs and rising profit margins. "We have successfully eliminated waste and redundancy," she declared, gesturing to a picture of a neatly packaged vide serving. "We are no longer catering to outdated, sentimental notions of food. We are delivering targeted, scientific nutrition. The residents are healthier, the population is leaner, and the bottom line has never looked better." A few of the residents, including Eleanor and her co-conspirators, had been strategically seated in the back. They listened to Celeste's speech, their faces calm, betraying none of the frantic, secret activity that had been happening just one floor below in the kitchen. Just as Celeste was wrapping up her triumphant speech, 2 new figures appeared at the back of the hall. The first was Sarah, the young journalist, her eyes wide with curiosity. The second was a tall, stooped, elderly man with a shock of white hair and a deeply lined face. It was Julian Croft, the legendary food critic. He looked around the sterile room, his expression one of profound disappointment. Celeste faltered for a moment, surprised by the interruption, but the board members, recognizing a powerful media presence, gestured for them to be seated. This was the moment. The twist was not planned, but it was perfect. As if on cue, the main doors to the hall swung open. A profound silence fell over the room. Wheeling a simple, stainless steel service cart was Arthur. He was no longer wearing his cook's apron, but a simple, clean white chef's jacket, one he hadn't worn in 30 years. It was old, frayed at the cuffs, but on him it looked like a suit of armor. Flanking him were Mr. Rodriguez and 2 other residents, their faces set with a solemn pride. On the cart was a single, large, enameled cast-iron pot. Arthur lifted the lid, and a fragrant cloud of steam billowed into the air, filling the sterile room with an aroma so rich, so complex, so deeply and wonderfully real that it was a physical shock. It was the scent of wine, of mushrooms, of herbs, of slow-braised chicken, of home. It was the smell of everything Celeste had tried to erase. Conversation ceased. The board members, who had been looking at their phones, looked up, their expressions changing from boredom to stunned curiosity. Celeste's face went pale, a mask of disbelief and fury. Arthur, his hands steady, began to plate his vin, serving the board members and the critic first. He worked with an unhurried, focused grace, the ghost of Antoine Dubois now fully present, commanding the room with nothing but a ladle and a lifetime of forgotten artistry. Julian Croft stared at the plate placed before him. The chicken was a deep, glossy mahogany, glistening in a sauce studded with pearl onions and mushrooms. The aroma alone was a story. He picked up his fork, his movement slow and deliberate, and took a single bite. He closed his eyes. The room was so quiet that the soft clink of his fork against the china seemed to echo. A series of emotions washed over the old critic's face: surprise, then disbelief, then a dawning, radiant recognition. A small, sad smile touched his lips. He opened his eyes, which were now suspiciously bright, and looked directly at Arthur. "Mon Dieu," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He then raised his voice, not addressing anyone in particular but making a grand pronouncement to the room. "There is only one person in the world who could make this dish. A dish that is at once rustic and sublime, powerful and yet full of grace. This is the cooking of Antoine Dubois." The name hung in the air like a thunderlap. The board members stared, confused. Sarah, the journalist, began scribbling furiously in her notepad, realizing she had stumbled upon a story far greater than she could have imagined. Celeste looked as if she had been struck by lightning, her face a mixture of shock and utter humiliation. "That's impossible," she stammered. He's just the cook." Eleanor Vance stood up from her seat in the back, her voice ringing with a clear, calm the rich teeth. "He is the cook," she said, "and he is also Chef Antoine Dubois. And for the past 6 months, you have had him serving nutrient paste from a machine." The story, in all its tragic and beautiful detail, came pouring out, told by Eleanor, confirmed by the silent, dignified presence of Arthur. and validated by the legendary critic who now sat eating his meal with a reverent joy. The corporate board, faced with a pure disaster of monumental proportions, the story of a forgotten genius being forced to serve slop by their own heartless consultant, went into immediate damage control. The resolution was swift and decisive. Celeste Munro was fired before she even had a chance to pack up her tablet. Her Nutrisphere program was scrapped, not just at Maple Creek, but across the entire company. The next day, a press release was issued. It announced the corporation's exciting new heritage dining initiative, a program dedicated to celebrating culinary tradition and honoring the wisdom of a generation. Its flagship location would be Maple Creek, where the dining hall was to be renovated and renamed Chef Antoine's Table. Arthur, or rather, Antoine, was offered a contract that made his eyes water. Not as a cook, but as an executive culinary artist, with full creative control and a staff to support him. He was given his name back, his dignity restored, not in the glittering, high-pressure world he had fled, but in the quiet, humble community that had seen him, fought for him, and given him a reason to cook again. A few weeks later, the new dining hall opened. It was warm and inviting, with soft lighting and comfortable chairs. The residents, dressed in their Sunday best, were served not from a buffet line, but at their tables, with real linens and silverware. The menu featured classics bœuf bourguignon, bouillabaisse, and a simple, perfect roast chicken that tasted of thyme and memory. Arthur, in a new, crisp chef's jacket, came out of the kitchen not to applause, but to something better, a room full of quiet, happy smiles. He walked to Eleanor's table. She was looking at him, her eyes shining with pride. "Welcome back, chef," she said softly. He smiled, a true, warm smile that reached his eyes for the first time in decades. "Thank you, Eleanor," he replied. "It's good to be home." He was no longer a ghost. No longer just a cook. He was Antoine Dubois, a man who had lost everything and, in the most unlikely of places, had found it all again, one plate at a time.